Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. What's going on, everybody? Today we have something a little different for you. Jackie Augustine and I couldn't get together in person for an episode of the Debrief Podcast, but there was so much we wanted to talk about. We hopped on a Zoom call and got through a whole bunch of stories that have bubbled over the last 2 weeks. We had a new report on the aging population and lack of healthcare infrastructure here in the Finger Lakes, the future of rural communities in the region as they battle rising costs in shrinking populations in light of that report, the latest on Seneca Meadows, as well as a pair of economic development related stories out of Geneva and Cayuga County. Check it out and be sure to follow the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts so you never miss another episode.
Sounds great.
How about we start with the Finger Lakes lacking in meeting seniors' health needs, because I feel like it's the most broad one. Common Ground Health says the Finger Lakes isn't equipped to meet the needs of seniors in the Finger Lakes. And obviously they were focusing on the entire Finger Lakes region, which includes the city of Rochester and Monroe County. It points out some pretty concerning trend lines, like a 44% increase in the population that is 65 plus living in this region by 2040. Also a decrease of 7 to 14% in all other age ranges from 0 to 64. When you saw that, what stood out to you from the report as a whole?
Well, I mean, I think it does kind of confirm what a lot of people have been saying, which is that, we have a large senior citizen population who are interested in aging in place. So even though some people might be wintering somewhere else, but for, by and large, people's primary residence is going to be here. For me, the thing that jumps out is like emergency services. Do we have the kind of paramedic infrastructure for that? I think for a long time, that's something that's been talked about, whether or not police and fire, but particularly fire, could be cross-trained for that. There was kind of pushback. I did see your interview with Kyle Brim, one of the candidates for city council, and it sounds like he's picking up on that thread and now thinks that's a good idea, which that's great. I feel like it's been a long time coming, but if someone wants to put that idea forward now, wonderful. But that's what I thought. Like, okay, do we have the housing, the services, the amenities that are actually going to serve our residents well as they're aging in place?
Yeah, I thought it was interesting. Obviously, the affordable housing aspect is something we've talked about a billion times now. We hear about it all the time. I think the phrase affordable housing has become this ambiguous thing that nobody really knows what it means. Does it mean like middle of the road market housing? Does it mean housing for the bottom 30% of the economy? Like what does it actually mean? But to your point, you mentioned the first responders, and I just got done yesterday with an interview with Wolcott Town Supervisor Lynn Chatfield. And one of the things that he mentioned, and there's a bunch of stuff I want to talk about later with that interview, but holy cow, one of the things that he mentioned in Wayne County was first response times are abysmal. They're just not good. He literally said they're not in a good place right now. So does Town Ambulance just closed up shop in the beginning of September. Out of the blue. There's one layer of that.
Right.
So do you have the first responder forces, but then also, lack of social workers, healthcare jobs. And, if you dig into that report a little bit, it points to a lot of basically the lowest paying jobs in healthcare that there is a lack of workforce for. And those are kind of like the the things to me that stand out as most concerning, right? Because those are going to be the things that are hardest to fix.
Right. And I mean, if we're already, I mean, people are already saying that nursing homes, assisted living centers are understaffed and workers are underpaid. If we're also seeing a declining younger population, that just means we have fewer people to potentially attract into those positions anyway. It just seems like, I hope somebody is putting together some kind of plan to increase wages, improve working conditions, and really make sure that, you know, we're investing in things that are important to us, like real quality care for seniors and kids. We're seeing the same thing in childcare, right? Yep. I mean, this crush. Very difficult for people to find childcare slots, very difficult for places to retain workers. I mean, the wages need to keep up. And some of that, I think, is going to require, you know, state incentives and assistance to make that happen.
It's funny because I'm reminded of one of the emails that I got a couple weeks ago from somebody who lives in Geneva that sent an email with an anonymous email address hooked to it. And they wanted me to ask any Geneva candidate that I interviewed what they're going to do to grow the tax base. And when I read this report, I just thought to myself, well, with ages 0 through 64 declining between 7 and 14% by 2040, every town, every village, every city in the Finger Lakes is going to have a tax base problem. No, like that just seems like almost a guarantee.
Yeah, everybody's eligible for STAR and enhanced STAR at that point. But I mean, I think that's funny that someone would send that question anonymously, as if A, it's an unusual question, or B, it's like not the first thing everybody's talking about anyway.
It's the least controversial question you could ask.
Right. So I feel like if you're going to go to all the trouble and submit something anonymously, it better be something more interesting than that. But anyway, okay, that's a side note.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about this Seneca Meadows stuff. We've had a couple more meetings since the last time we talked. We also had a very large story in the New York Times drop, which I think was about 1 week before the back-to-back meetings in Seneca Falls. The first meeting was centered around the town's comprehensive plan updating process. The other one was a public listening session that was put on by Seneca Meadows as part of this whole DEC application permit process. No technical changes, nothing like technically I don't think has changed since the last time we talked, but I'm curious, having a lot of things happen since the last time you and I talked. What have you seen that stood out to you?
Well, I thought what was very interesting in the New York Times article was that the reporter went all in on trying to ask some of the town board members if the political contributions to their campaign had influenced their positions. And then it's like, oh, the story broke, or, you know, they had been interviewed for the story at some point prior to these meetings. And then we had seen this kind of pausing of the process. And I thought, wow, I wonder what this total like change of heart is. I'm not saying that once you shine a spotlight on things that are going on, people get nervous and try to operate a different way. But sometimes maybe that happens. And I just thought it couldn't have come at a better time. Actually, an article like this could have come a long time ago and would have been really helpful. But I think rather better that it's a story about this community currently trying to work through this question than just a retrospective about how one small town and all of the adjacent communities that bear the traffic, the odor, the noise, the health disparities caused by this landfill, how it was allowed to ruin the area. So I don't know. I was really glad to see the article. I'm hoping that it does cause people to take a second look. I thought it was really interesting that the quote that finished it from one of the supporters community member, supporter of the landfill, was like, well, it's just odor, and odor's just a nuisance and it's not a health issue. When it seems like we're getting some information from Department of Health and maybe some other indicators. If you look at landfill off-gassing in other communities in other states, odor is made up of particulates, and those are chemical compounds. Like, if you can smell it, something is entering your system. We need to know more about what that is. So I think it really laid out there kind of all the stuff that's at play.
It was a really good timeline. I think more than anything else, it gave a really good timeline of everything that's happened over, say, the last two-ish, I would say like 2 to 3 years. One of the things that stood out to me was this was Albany's wake-up call, that this is an issue in upstate, that Albany, whether it's lawmakers, whether it's Kathy Hochul, whether it's the DEC, they need to take this seriously, because people here actually care about it. And I think it bubbles well beyond, I know it bubbles well beyond just like the, say, 20 to 30 mile radius around Seneca Meadows. I was talking with some friends last week, live out towards Buffalo, and, I'd never had a conversation with them about the landfill ever. And I'm not sure they read the New York Times, but they did ask me what was going on with this landfill out in the middle of the Finger Lakes. So, I think it's a wake up call for them. I caution anybody who thinks that the way the vote went at a meeting a few weeks ago is indicative of where this issue is going in terms of how the board will vote in the future.
Okay.
Don't think that. Don't think that this is reflective of that at all. Because I think if that exact same vote was held the day after election day and the town supervisor who is currently the town supervisor was not the town supervisor, I think that the vote would have turned out completely different.
Okay.
That's my having watched Seneca Falls politics for a while. That's my position on it. And it's, at the end of the day, yes, this landfill issue for a lot of people feels larger than life. But at the end of for a lot of the political actors in Seneca Falls, you still have that day-to-day like politicking happening. And you still have the normal, like kind of like personality conflicts that crop up, mellow out, crop up, mellow out, that kind of thing. And it's an election season. So of course, things are, I think, a little more dramatic because of that. Because one big thing that stood out to me was it almost felt like some people, maybe because they haven't been watching this a very long time, felt like this was a big moment because the draft host agreement was quote unquote voted down. But we're so early in that process still, with Seneca Meadows working through the process of potentially expanding, that really nothing was going to be, concrete. Nothing was going to be in stone, from that from that meeting or from that draft agreement. They could have agreed to it and then changed it 7 times between now and when it was actually implemented. The other thing that I thought was interesting that didn't get much talk time afterward was the ambiguity of certain parts of it, where like the top end number was talked about a lot, but there was actually a lot of wiggle room for potential, departures from that number if certain conditions were not met. That's something that I think everybody should be thinking about, because this isn't just an annual check of $10 million from Seneca Meadows to the town of Seneca Falls. Nothing is ever that simple, and this would definitely not be any different than that. But it's interesting. I've been trying to do some digging around and asking some different people when they think a decision might be made, because technically 2 public information sessions, public listening sessions into the process, I don't think Seneca Meadows has to do too much more publicly before they can go ahead with making a decision. And, when I think about the people who have been advocating against Seneca Meadows expansion. I think the lack of DEC presence in Seneca Falls at these meetings is kind of concerning. I feel like that's concerning. Do you feel like that's because a couple people have looked at me like sideways, like I'm crazy for thinking that, but like I feel like not seeing the DEC here is kind of a sign of them not taking this seriously.
Yeah, I think it's so crazy that, I mean, can we just talk about the fact that this is a process that is supposed to get public comment and raise issues that the DEC would then require Seneca Meadows to address or remedy, but also for the DEC to have follow-up inquiries about if warranted. And they're held at the discretion of and led by the applicant themselves. They are reported on and submitted to the DEC largely by the applicant themselves. There's a separate, kind of comment thing. But also, it is anything goes, right? You can stand up and make a public comment in any way. I could stand up and say, trash is a wonderful thing. I actually think after 30 years, it converts into gold nuggets and the community really needs gold nuggets. I mean, that's going to be entered into the public record. And there's no, it seems like a scientific process would have some boundaries and parameters that we're not seeing here. And that just makes it look like it's kind of a sham process, right? We have to say we did something. We have to have a public meeting. And I'm not putting this on Seneca Meadows. I'm saying that this is the problem with the DEC's process, that it's an uncritical look at operations. Maybe you can raise things and enter things into the record that then a DEC specialist would say, oh, we better think about that. But there's no requirement for you to have any expertise to speak. And there's also, no attempt to generate expertise, community expertise from what's being said. So it just seems weird to me. It's just like we might as well all meet in the school auditorium and raise our hands, heads up, 7-up. Is this something we want or is it not? Because how do you parse out an argument? How do you make a case for expansion or a case against expansion if all you're really doing is taking the temperature of the room? Like and I mean, that's not enough, right? If you were just taking the temperature of the room, I don't think it would go through. But it kind of boggles my mind that this is actually a government process that we're participating in, because usually government processes are so bureaucratic, so rule-based, so technical. And this really just feels like I said, anything goes. It's kind of like a public comment free-for-all. Say whatever you want, and it's all going to be summarized. And then what? I mean, what is the follow-up? What is the mechanism? It's just not, I don't know. I think this is how we end up with big mega landfills concentrated in small communities that don't necessarily have the expertise and kind of public base to be able to look critically at an issue when there is money at stake.
It doesn't feel like a process. That's what came to mind as you were talking through that entire, like, kind of the bizarre scenario that it is. But one of the questions that I keep seeing on social runs along this line. How much do we think the top end of Albany, we're talking like the Hochul administration, the top end of the DEC, Basil Sagos and others, how much do we think they're actually putting into this, thinking about this? How much of a discussion is this? Because that question keeps popping up on social media, and I'm curious because I don't really feel like I have a good gut read on it. But just going exclusively by the DEC process and how the DEC is just kind of going along, it seems. I can't convince myself that it's front of mind of anybody in Albany.
Well, I'm about to say something really cynical, I think. So, in a way, I don't think they're thinking about it, because what's the alternative? The alternative is come up with a different waste management solution, which either cites a new facility in a new place, which is going to be an uphill battle now that everybody knows what it's like, or totally redo the way that New York City and all communities handle their garbage, recycling, food waste, et cetera, which, to the state's credit, they're making incremental changes. New York City City Council now is mandatory food waste composting, small changes, all important, but slow. In the meantime, you've got a Democratic administration who's looking at this and thinking, well, you got some upstate communities who are sending minority members to the state assembly and and state senate, whose representatives are all for landfills, prisons, Bitcoin mining, fracking, whatever. They want to take all the stuff no one else wants. I mean, if you're the Hochul administration, it's like, we've got this problem. We need to take care of waste. Where are we going to put it? Oh, well, here are these people over here who say they'd love it. It's not good for them. We don't think they should have it, but I guess it solves a problem. Like, again, it's cynical, because I'd like to think that elected officials, no matter their party affiliation, really do want what's best for the people. But I mean, let's be honest, right? We have elected officials who have particular corporate interests. We have elected officials who have partisan issues or interests, and those two seem to converge with our local officials saying, yes, give us the trash for the whole state and the region and, the entire Northeast, we'll take it. And them saying, okay, great, then we don't have to worry about putting it anywhere else. That's a deal. There you go.
Yeah.
And that just, it's terrible to me. It's like, okay, we made our bed and they're happy to let us lie in it. And it's like, no, please, objectively, this is a bad idea. But politically, it makes a lot of sense from their perspective.
And it's interesting because one of the other theories that I keep seeing crop up in the comment section on Facebook, which I think is probably the worst place in the world to actually go look for insightful anything when it comes to this stuff. Right. Yeah. Is, well, maybe the DEC will do like a half measure where they give Seneca Meadows like an 8-year expansion green light instead of a full like 16 or 17, however long it ends up being. And I just thought to every time I see something like that, even if you take that comment in good faith, it feels like you're just ignoring the fact that I'm not sure New York State has the wherewithal to come up with an alternative plan at the moment.
Yeah. I mean, 8 years sounds like a long time, but I mean, we have seen the mountains of trash in our backyards to the east and the west, not to mention High Acres, right? We haven't even talked about that, or the one down in Chemung. Like, I mean, we've been watching this, and people have been saying this isn't going to be able to happen forever. This is going to affect our groundwater and our air quality, and it's going to be unsightly and it's going to stink and all this kind of stuff. And people are just like, well, we'll eventually figure it out. But who's working on it? Who is appointed by the state to be the waste management czar? Remember, a long time ago, we had an upstate economic development czar appointed. That was, remember, long time ago, maybe 15, 20 years ago, people were like, wow, the upstate economy is on the decline. We really need to focus on it. And, we got these different economic development zones, and a lot of the things, to their credit, a lot of the things they said they were going to address back then got addressed, because they said, this is the person who we're going to hold accountable for it. But who is accountable for waste management? The DEC is regulatory, but who are the policymakers putting their heads together and coming up with something on this? I don't see it.
It's also I think it's also complicated by the fact that, yes, a lot of the waste is obviously coming from New York City, but it's coming from outside the state too. And I don't think the state knows exactly how to deal with that. Do you just create a rule that waste can't travel more than 40 miles? Like, do you just put like an arbitrary number on it? It feels like that would be the direction the state would have to go if they were going to deny Seneca Meadows their extension, because the timeline that they would be put on to try and figure out what to do with the waste that's going there now. Right. I mean, you're talking about short order. Like a year and a half.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because of course, if you tried to ban out of state trash, I'm sure the landfills would band together for some kind of interstate commerce clause, a legal action. But remember, it was a while ago, again, dating myself here. This was about 25 years ago when New York State agreed to allow tandem trailers on state highways, on Route 14 and on Route 5. I mean, we could revisit that. Why aren't we asking them to roll that back? Is it going to make a bunch of local trucking companies and local landfill operators upset? Because will the cost of importing out-of-state garbage go way up if they can't have tandem trailers anymore? Yes. But if we're serious about tackling the question of out-of-state trash, there's something that is within the state's purview that it could do. But will they? Again, my question is, who is actually taking it seriously on a state level? Our local elected officials are not. I mean, like our assembly and Senate, our town boards and city councils are all conflicted because they see the dollar signs and everybody apparently has a price. So who's actually saying, as a public policy measure, waste needs a solution, which is not necessarily waste solutions, right? It has to be a problem that we think seriously about, and nobody wants, I'm going to use a cliche. It's a dirty job. Somebody's got to do it. No one wants to do it.
Yeah.
So what doesn't get done? If nobody's paying attention to it on that regard, it's not getting done. We're all just in our silos talking about it and being angry about it.
I am reminded of all of the state budget talks when Andrew Cuomo was governor, that headlined or sublined with something along the lines of 3 men in a room. And it feels a lot like this is going to be decided by a small group of individuals that no one will ever know, and no one will ever know the identity of, behind closed doors, and the region will be left with the outcome of it. Honestly, that's kind of where Well,
in that regard, I mean, you're right, because what really has changed, the 3 men in a room referred to the fact that you had a Democratic governor, a Democratic head of the state assembly, and a Republican head of the state Senate. What we have right now, like I said, is a Democratic governor, but our representatives at the state level are Republicans, but they are in agreement that it's okay to dump on us. So we don't, I mean, it was the same then as it is now. If nobody who's a party to the situation wants it to change, then it's not going to change. And if we want it to change, well, then we should have considered whether or not the people that we're putting in the decision making share our values. But to be fair to our state Senate and Assembly members from our particular area, they were open about their affiliation with the waste management industry and their regard for it as a legitimate economic driver, and they ended up in the seats. So you can't really fault them for then being okay with it continuing, because that's what they said they felt when they got the job.
I also think it maybe is a little unfair to think that even if they were opposed, even if they were outwardly opposed every day, sending out a press release saying shut down Seneca Meadows and all other landfills, that it would change the problem that the state's going to have to deal with in any way, shape, or form, which is nothing more than they have no idea what to do with, tens of thousands of tons of trash per week that's largely coming from places like New York City. I mean, it's just kind of like this. It's a really.
I don't want to be like totally pie in the sky and say that they could make a stink, no pun intended, and solve this problem. Okay. But we don't know what it would look like to have state level advocacy on this issue from our jurisdictions because we haven't had it. So it's easy for us to say, well, that wouldn't change anything. But, the New York Times article, that did shake things up. Attention, sunlight on the issue, some accountability for the decisions being made, someone asking follow-up questions, someone shining a bright light on it. I think those things do matter. And I'm not saying it would change it overnight, but what I'm saying is that with nobody seriously, continuously looking at this issue in an elected capacity, we're not well served by that, I guess would be my conclusion.
Yeah, no doubt. Okay, so a couple economic development stories to get to quick here before we wrap it up. First, in Cayuga County has gone through its second economic development agency executive director in basically 6 months ish. The executive director prior lasted just 2 months. The Citizen had a really good story that we posted on this. If you want to see all of the details around CETA and what they're doing to try and figure out what's next for them, check out the website. We've got it there. But a reader question that came in from Auburn after this story was online relates to continuity. How important is continuity when it comes to economic development? Alice wrote to ask, both of us are coming at this from different backgrounds, so she's curious where we stand. How important do you think the continuity aspect is when it comes to economic development? There's also a Geneva story related to the Enterprise Development Center that I want to talk about in a few minutes too. But on continuity to that question, how important is that to economic development for a whole county?
Well, I think that's an interesting point because, in theory, the person shouldn't matter, right? You should be able to have your economic development director change out for whatever reason and not really lose a lot of steam if the underpinning is that you've done the work to actually make an economic development plan in the first place. So, if the plan is sound, then in theory, it could be carried out by anybody. But I can't figure out why they keep saying, it's misalignment with the board. Well, when you hire someone, don't you say, here's the vision, here's the plan. Does this look like something you want to carry out? I don't understand. The way it's happened, and again, I'm just an outsider. I have no idea what's going on, behind closed doors. But to have two people come in and leave, and the reason to be misalignment makes it sound like false advertising, right? You said the position was going to be this, the people hit the ground running, and all of a sudden it's nothing like what they thought. Or they weren't honest when they said, this is what I want to do. And then they come in and all of a sudden they don't want to do that. So, I don't know. I think those are two different issues, right? I'm wondering what is their selection process like? Right. But, should they be able to still have effective economic development, even with turnover? Yes, if there is actually a plan.
Right. The first thing I thought of was, because I went back to vision, that was the first word that came to mind. What is the county's vision for economic development? And is the vision bad? And then I got to thinking well, Central New York is really focused on Micron right now for good reason. And everything is kind of aligned in that direction. How can we prepare ourselves for Micron coming in and being a big part of our regional economy? And once you get that out of the way, you realize that, okay, so vision isn't the problem, it's execution. And it seems like, I don't know that personalities on the board of directors would be having an impact, but it seems like, to your point, something is broken in the fundamental workflow between board of directors, executive director, and whoever else is involved in the day-to-day operating of CETA. And to answer the question, how important is continuity? I think it's really important in terms of trust, public trust. I think this has a bigger impact on the people actually legislating in Cayuga County. So the Cayuga County legislature, I think, has a bigger mess on its hands because of this CETA issue with leadership turnover than CETA does itself. Because to your point, if a large corporation decides that they want to plant themselves in Cayuga County, they're going to find their way there, whether you have one executive director, no executive director, or 2 in 2 months. That doesn't matter, right? But this kind of creates that another layer of public mistrust in something that people are already really skeptical of. People are really skeptical of economic development agencies. And this, when you hear language like misalignment with the board, oh man, it stirs up all the things and feelings.
Right. Yeah. And it would make me wonder, like, okay, let's assume that the people that were recruited are well-trained economic development professionals. What are they finding so intolerable or so misguided or wrong-headed about what they're being asked to do? Like, is anybody like checking the plan and making sure, like, have they tasked them and said, look at, the key to our future is we just want to get a Red Lobster, a dollar store, and a Motel 6, and we are going to be golden. And the person's like, okay, like, I need to let you know that's not actually going to help you. I don't know. Or are they, not looking? Are they not sorting for the right kind of qualification? It's kind of an interesting puzzle. It seems like they should issue more of an explanation, to your point about public trust. Like, how about letting people know rather than just this soundbite, like what's actually going on?
And the other question that popped in my head is, if you're the executive director of a county economic development agency, what can you possibly do wrong in 2 months that warrants you being terminated?
Right.
Like, the wheels, everybody knows government moves slow as slow can be. And it's like, what could possibly happen in the course of 60 days that is like so cataclysmic that the person just has to be canned? Like, there's absolutely no other option. It's crazy.
No, like HR directors, like, we just went through all the paperwork. Like, what are you saying? Like,
yeah.
No idea.
Last question, another economic development one. Finger Lakes Times had a story the other day about the Geneva IDA being kind of this crossroads with the Enterprise Development Center. Sounds like a pretty steep price tag. Would be, I think, 16, 17 million to get this building across the finish line. And then kind of like what do we do with it after that? Because apparently that really wasn't thought of too greatly to this point. So the question is, what should Geneva do with this piece of property? It's huge, right? If it's the one that I'm thinking of, it's very large and big opportunity, but also a pretty big liability if it's left kind of like just languishing, no?
Yes. And without rehashing all the history of how the city ended up with that in the first place, I will just say sometimes a bad decision at the outset is not made better by throwing more money at it. That's not to say that I think the idea of a business incubator space is bad. I think that's an excellent idea. But that is the idea that kind of came about when the city and the city IDA kind of got itself in trouble with that piece of property in the first place. So when we talk about, again, with this economic development plan in Cayuga County, Geneva's got its own issue in that I don't think if you were to ask every member of the IDA to explain to you why that property was initially valuable and when you say getting it to the finish line, what that actually means, what would be the outcomes, what are the deliverables that they're looking for, I think you'd get several different answers. And I think that's part of the problem. And in general, I think that when you're talking about spending government dollars, I don't care if it's an agency, an authority, the city government proper, whatever, county money, you don't just spend the money without understanding where you're going with it. And I think, no bad statements against the current IDA, because many of the people are new. So they're kind of coming at this and trying to figure out what previous IDAs got them into. But I think that's the point. Like, we had previous IDAs that had either no clear plan in terms of outcomes. They had some ideas, they had some feelings of what they might like, but they weren't really investigating the market conditions and trying to figure out, what do we need and how do we get there? And how do we right size that building to get the outcomes we want without getting ourselves so deeply invested in it that we have this kind of conundrum where we think, oh my goodness, so do we just cut our losses or do we invest a bunch more? For years and years and years, the IDA of Geneva, it did not serve Geneva as well as it could have. And part of that is because it didn't have a good plan. So now we're seeing that, can they salvage something? I hope. I think there is a role for that space, or at least that concept in a different space, to play. But that's another place where we could be cooperating with the town of Geneva, right? It benefits all of us to have new businesses starting. And this idea that we're just looking at it from the immediate tax revenue, I think it misses the mark. Meanwhile, the IDA is happily giving pilots to stuff that seems out of line with our goals and interests, but that's a topic for another day.
I would love to know, this has gotten me thinking about the success rate of different kinds of redevelopment of factories, big, old, cumbersome properties, compared to other developments that IDAs, economic development agencies, put forward, because I feel like these fail at a higher rate than all of the others. And it feels more like a liability at this point than anything else. And right. I can't see a scenario where the IDA moves forward with anything in the next 30 to 60 days without having some kind of, maybe like a plan falls out of the sky that has all the deliverables, that has all the data that's needed. That would be great if it happened. But in lieu of that, it feels like any action that would be taken in the next month or two would just lead to regret down the road.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. And I think, again, the idea of that space in the first place was really grounded in what we now know in retrospect was a really antiquated notion of economic development. But there were so many holdover members of the board that really didn't want to give that up, that we really got ourselves into a mess. And I like to use the word we, because I don't like to single people out. Unless they really are the sole person who's responsible for something. And I'd like people to think about it as a community problem, right? It's easy to say, oh, the IDA is messing this up, but this is our community. The IDA works for the community. So we need to help them kind of reorient themselves and get this right.
Yeah. And it's kind of like I would like to see a different approach at all IDAs and all economic development agencies to kind of break away from this notion of, let's take this gigantic old building and divide it all up and see how many businesses we can start inside of it. Because post-pandemic world, so few businesses, small businesses, actually need brick and mortar to get off the ground in the first place, that it just feels tired. And honestly, when I look at large properties like that, the only thing I think about in terms of solving a problem that's like a society-wide problem is housing. Like, that's it.
Yeah.
There isn't any, unless you're talking about a business coming in and taking over an entire factory to build something, like, okay, that I get that. That's a direct, same use as before kind of situation. But this, housing is pretty much the only thing that seems viable in those scenarios. That's just my take.
Well, can we make a full circle point here then? You started by asking about the senior housing study and kind of the rate of rising senior population. If people want to take economic development seriously, if they actually want to talk about what good, tried and true economic development is from people who are experts in this across the country. Businesses are going to go where the people are, where the workforce is. And what we're seeing is that all the trends in the Finger Lakes are a declining workforce. We talked about it just in terms of care positions, but think about manufacturing, think about tourism, think about retail. Like if you have a declining working age population, you have a declining workforce. The way out of that is through workforce housing. Ontario County seems to be kind of getting that message now, although there's a lot of reluctance from the western end of the county who just wants to talk about senior citizen housing, which I'm not saying we don't need. But again, they can only think of it in these siloed, isolated ways. They don't understand that community building has to be for all segments of the community. And, you focus on high-end housing to the exclusion. You want high-end housing. People who want high-end housing want certain amenities, stores, opportunities. If you have no one to work there, they're not coming here. Then you're going to lose your high-end residents. Like, they just don't see it as the full picture because they're so invested in the soundbite issue, the politically, salient issue. They're all focused on getting themselves elected, and they're not really interested in governing. That's my election season take, just by and large.
And that right there is where I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to add anything to that. That is the cherry on top of the sundae.